Today I'm going to show you how to refinish a nitro finish guitar with nitro and obtain a relic finish like this. So just before I talk about the process, let me give you an overview of where this guitar is at the moment. So essentially what you want to do is make sure your surface of your guitar is nice and clean. My special method for doing that is to use a mix of acetic acid and methylated spirits. So acetic acid is essentially distilled vinegar, and meths is something that you can't get in the States. So if you're watching this in America, lots of people use naphtha to clean the surface. In the UK, you could use lighter fluid. And then once your surface is clean, you're basically spraying on your new colour. Now for this one, I've used a vintage white. Now, whenever I spray, I tend to put on 3 coats in one sitting, 15 minutes apart, and then I wait 24 hours or 48 hours on the safe side before putting on another 3 coats. And with my base coat here, the vintage white, I actually only put on 3 coats because what I want to be doing is chipping through the coat to see the coating that's underneath. Now to add to that age look, this is a bit of sort of an artistic technique, and it's up to you how you do it and how much you put on. But essentially I like to put a scratch plate in the place where the scratch plate normally is, and then I spray over the body using a translucent colour. So in this case I'm using a mix of an amber in one spray and a nicotine colour in the other spray. And when you put those sprays on, I tend to put them on really lightly, really cautiously. I tend to focus in on certain areas. So for example, I've put a little bit more amber and a little bit more nicotine on in the area where the guitar may make contact with your arm when you're playing, because I feel like that's the area that might get dirtiest. Making sure I have a good look at it in between, so properly looking in daylight to make sure I'm happy with what the effect looks like. So when you're putting nitro on top of nitro, essentially the lacquer melts into the layer underneath. So unlike when you're using something like a poly or an acrylic and you need to sand the surface to allow the new layers to key into what's there and really bond, the nitro bonds into itself. So you don't have to worry at any point about sanding unless you've got a surface that's a bit uneven. Let's say for some reason your spray's gone on and there's a little bit of lumps there, or a little bit of dust that's been caught in it. But one thing I like about good nitro is it does tend to lay flat. It does tend to lay very thin though, which is why you often want to put on multiple coats. Here's your word of warning: when you use nitro, you need to leave it to cure afterwards. I recommend 2 to 3 weeks, but often I leave it longer than that. I've never had a problem after I've left it a month. Next I move on to the stage which is the most exciting bit, where I'm creating the checking or the cracking that appears in the nitro surface. Now, nitro cracks over time, and one of the problems with modern nitro is they're not the same formula as those ones you might have had in vintage guitars, so they don't crack and check quite as easily. In fact, a really good nitro may not even crack if left in good conditions. But the thing that makes the nitro crack is expansion and contraction. So when it gets hot and cold and hot and cold. So the way we trick the guitar into doing that is I use a heat gun. You could use a hairdryer. I make sure it's not too hot and I work my way slowly over the surface, heating it up. And then I need to cool it. And I find the best way to cool it is to use these cans. It's an air duster can. You get them to clean things like your keyboards. And essentially, if you give it a good shake and turn it upside down, when you press the button, what comes out is a nice cold jet of air. It's actually got moisture in it as well, so I tend to have to wipe the surface down afterwards. And what you'll notice, particularly on a solid colour that's light like this, is the checking doesn't appear straight away, or sometimes it's quite hard to see. So you may have to do this process more than once. And the other thing is, you may want to do it more than once, but focus in on certain areas look more checked than others. Again, this is an artistic thing. It's a matter of your own taste. And one thing I would recommend is looking at lots of photos of relics guitars, natural relics. Find source material that you want to emulate in some way. And once you've got all that cracking and checking in, it's still quite hard to see. So there's another stage to the process. In order to make those cracks become more prevalent, you can darken them by putting something in the crack. Now, I normally use acrylic paint mixed with water so it's a bit more dilute, and I paint it onto the surface and wipe it off. And I definitely recommend put it on and wipe it off quickly. Have a look at what you've got and then keep repeating until you get it to look as dark as you want it to look. I prefer using a brown colour. I think it looks a bit more natural if it's brown. Some people might use a black. There's no reason you could go in with a totally different colour if you want to do something even more artistic. You could use wood dye, but one of the problems is sometimes the dye tends to stain the nitro quite quickly, even if you wipe it off. So it's always good to test in a spot which isn't going to be visible in the end. So if, for example, you've got a bolt-on neck and you've got a neck plate at the back, I would always test on that area because that area is going to be hidden. You could test underneath the pick guard because that area is going to be hidden. These are the places for you to experiment. I've seen people rub into the cracks ground coffee that's got a bit of moisture in it, so it's more like a paste, or even wax. There are some companies that make waxes that you can put on your fretboard to darken the fretboard, and that kind of wax might work quite well, but I've always been an acrylic person. Now for this one, my client wanted very subtle relic. So what I've done is just made a few indentations in a few spaces. This process is really easy to expand out, and you can do it all over the guitar. You can get more and more aggressive if you want. Now I'm using a wood carving knife to make these scratches in. Sometimes you can do it with a cabinet scraper, or even something like a X-Acto blade or a scalpel. What I like about this carving knife is that the blade's a bit thicker than a scalpel. It's not as sharp. So when I'm rubbing onto it, it's doing more chipping. You can see I've got my camera out here, and that's because I've got some source material that I'm looking at. I've shown my clients some photos of relic guitars that they liked, and I'm basically trying to copy how those are relic, the really minimal elements on it. But I've actually got videos where I make a more heavy relic, so if you want to see them, those are linked in the description to this video. There's quite a few different methods for getting relic finishes, so do check out my other videos because they are quite varied, and I try to demonstrate as many different ones as I can. People seem to like the way I relic guitars. I know people use my videos to do this themselves. If you're one of those people that have made a relic at home based on my videos, please let me know. Making these videos is great fun. I enjoy doing it. I enjoy the education element of it. But the most rewarding thing is knowing people have used them. You can even share with me on social media if you want. And if you have found this useful, you may consider tipping me a cup of tea by hitting the super thanks button or going to my Ko-Fi page, which is linked in the description of this video. And a stage I like to do at the end is a bit of buffing, but unlike when I'm buffing up a guitar for a final really high gloss shine, I tend to just buff not all over, not consistent, and I find what that does is it helps add to that relic look. I tend to focus in the areas that are most likely to get wear against the body. So for example, where the arm is resting on it again, that's going to be the shiniest, most buffed, polished area. So I focus in on them. I'm only buffing with a buffing compound and a foam pad on the end of my drill. If you want to see my whole process for buffing, I've got a series of videos on that because it's quite a complicated process if you want to get a really mirror shine gloss. Again, all linked in the video descriptions below. So here's some footage of the guitar now it's finished. Well, finished from my point of view. I sent this back to my client. My client then had a neck that they wanted to put on it, and they had their own pickguard, etc. Here's some photos they sent me back of it finished. Well, once again, hope this has been useful for you, and until next time, happy strumming.